Welcome to Prediction News Update, y'all. My name's Chris Gerlacher. I'm the senior political analyst and industry analyst for Prediction News. And man, we've got 3 weeks of stuff to cover. We need to talk about the NCLGS panel on prediction markets that I was on, talking to state lawmakers about prediction markets. We're going to talk about a Fourth Circuit decision not related to prediction markets that could weigh in on Kalshi's case in Maryland. We need to talk about Blanche Lincoln and how she's become a lobbyist for Kalshi, which is a reversal that's about 15 years old. That's very interesting and worth hitting on. And we're going to talk about Polymarket and Predicted. They've gotten a lot of heat taken off of them in the last week or so. So last week was a big week for prediction market at the industry level. And to help me make sense of it all is Dan Wallach. Daniel Wallach is a sports betting appellate lawyer and legal mind extraordinaire. Dan, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Chris, it was awesome to see you in Louisville for the NCLGS panel on prediction markets. We're going to talk about that shortly, but it just seems like you're always at the center of some real controversial panels around prediction markets. I think by design they're controversial, but man, oh man, that was a pretty wild one. Almost the same level of pretty much at the same level of emotion as the one we did a couple of months ago. So we'll talk about that, but clearly there are some diverging or divisive opinions on both the legality of prediction markets as well as the consumer safeguards or lack thereof that may be apparent in some of these markets.
Yeah, that was a sticking point for one of Kalshi's lawyers. So Joshua Sterling is one of the lawyers working on not just Kalshi's case, but also crypto.com. He's part of the law firm representing these platforms in court and helping them out with the cease and desist orders that they've been getting from around the country. So one of the points he made that I know rattled the room, and this is a gathering of legislators from gaming states. So they're all, interested in how to regulate gaming and gambling in these really more responsible ways. And the finance industry does not quite have its own responsible gambling conversation in the way that the gaming industry does. Dan, you felt the room shake in the audience. Maybe you want to go through how did his answer come up to you? Tell us what it was and then how the room felt.
Well, I mean, throughout his entire discourse, he was sort of the lightning rod of the panel, right? You had Alex Kane, yourself, both you guys are fairly, just not overly bombastic, although you at times could be a little, no, I'm kidding. You're not overly bombastic. He played the role of being, he brought the bombast and the aggression to the panel. And I guess that was his role because he was going into the lion's den as sort of the enemy of state governments, and he really took to that role and basically showcased an abrasive type personality. I mean, he was making a lot of legal points. I mean, he wasn't totally a jerk, but he said a few things that I wouldn't say rattled the room, but rubbed people the wrong way. And you got to begin with his flippant comment about responsible gambling, essentially. And I'm paraphrasing here. You have the exact quote from the Prediction News article you wrote, but he said something to the effect of, listen, if somebody loses their shirt, loses their money, that's on them. And, it almost underscores or highlights in his mind that it's the gamblers or the customer's problem and not the problem of Kalshi or the CFTC. And that kind of runs contrary. That is anathema to everything that is central to the regulation of sports betting, which is consumer protections, responsible gambling safeguards. And he threw that out as if it were non-relevant. And I don't think that showed or portrayed either him or his client, and not just the most positive light, but in a favorable light at all. And it may come back to bite him and his client in future litigations and future legal papers, because the first quote that I'm going to jam into a complaint or a response to a motion for preliminary injunction is the total absence or total disregard for RG displayed by Kalshi's counsel. And that's attributable to Kalshi because he's acting as Kalshi's legal representative in the courts.
Yeah, it is. You look at the finance industry, and it is consistent with how they've approached those issues in the past. I don't think they've had to confront responsible gaming or their version of it really until the rise of the App Store, really. I mean, once the guy in the suit you have to go talk to change your portfolio became an app, and you see this big rise in retail investing. I mean, even complicated derivatives are available to customers now. So they have some new questions they have to talk about that they, maybe they should have decades ago, but they really haven't had to with the same urgency that they do now, I think. And I think that came out on the panel too.
Yeah, but I mean, on a more serious or problematic level, it almost reflects Kalshi's, not prioritizing the types of consumer protections that are part and parcel of a regulated sports betting framework, and that's going to matter, I think, to the courts that are not just going to look at this from a technical legal lens, but what could ultimately be influential are the differences between event contracts traded on DCMs versus the way sports wagering is regulated at the state level. And I think the more that there's a disparity and a disconnect between how those two are regulated, I think that could end up giving courts and maybe a judge some pause about it. And if you're representing Kalshi in court, being controversial may be on brand for a panel and may shake up the room, but ultimately you have to be concerned about how this is going to be received by state lawmakers, by the public, and ultimately by courts. And that kind of stuff becomes, just Exhibit A in a future legal pleading or a future legal memorandum that some, aggrieved party might file and just highlight those statements made by Kalshi's outside counsel at a time when Kalshi is allowing trading on its contracts to those who are 18 years old and over, whereas most regulated sports betting markets are 21 and over. So that kind of comment becomes added baggage to the RG debate and highlighting the differences between the two types of markets, even though the product or the underlying product may in substance be the same.
He also talked about that RG conversation is also consistent with the direction that everyone in the prediction market industry is trying to go. He also talked about, let me pull up the quote here. Every company, this is him now, every company out there that I represent, and even the ones that I don't, is trying to build the everything app on the phone because that's how people aged 25 to 35 view their portfolio. They can trade stocks, zero data expiration options, crypto, FX, events, horses, you name it. They want to trade it because they view it as their financial portfolio. So there is this movement in finance customers, especially among younger customers, to be able to trade anything. And everyone in this industry right now is racing toward that everything app. I don't know if it'll be Kalshi, but events are going to be a huge part of that. And Kalshi may not offer horses now, but remember the election. After the election, they had all of these new markets come out. It wasn't just the congressional control markets. It wasn't just the presidential market. It was, electoral college results, margins of victory, gubernatorial races, other countries' presidential and parliamentary elections, right? The category exploded. And so if they prevail in Maryland and certainly the Third Circuit, I think you'll see sports explode as well. So I didn't say this on the panel, but Kalshi wins in Maryland, sports or horses could be next after sports.
I mean, I don't see any barrier to that because you have these two developments moving in parallel. You have Brian Quintan's, and we're going to get to him shortly, and he's about to be confirmed as the CFTC chairman. And from his lens, pretty much everything is fair game in terms of what can be offered as an event contract. Everything is a commodity. Everything can be listed as an event contract. So whether we're talking about proposition bets on sport, on occurrences within sporting events, player individual performance, or even horse race wagering, or even casino contracts on outcomes of slot machines, all of that can be traded in a world that Brian Quintan's oversees without any kind of constraints on his authority. But that works in tandem with Kalshi's ability under the CFTC regime to self-certify its own contract. So you have the non-enforcement and basically the green light being given by the regulator, and Kalshi's permissionless ability to offer anything it wants through the process of self-certification within 24 hours of declaring it. Those two factors will lead to an immediate or an expedited offering of all types of new and novel event contracts tied to sporting events, racing involving animals, and occurrences or outcomes within a casino environment. So that's the world we're headed to by virtue of the way the CFTC regime is written, as well as the new chairman and the role that he's going to embrace going forward. I mean, it all points heavily in that direction. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, we should tell people that we're recording Monday morning on the 21st, and he is set, Brian Quintens is set to get his committee vote today, possibly while we're recording. So he may be cleared for a full Senate vote in the next few minutes for us, but certainly by the time this is released, he'll we'll have a better idea of when the full Senate will vote on his confirmation, I think.
It's so not in doubt that there would not even be an event contract on it. It's almost like a coronation. And my greatest fear has come true in the podcast. My 2-year-old son has just entered the room, but he's sitting on the chair next to me. So hopefully he'll be out of camera range for a little while, but you may hear him from time to time. But he's been a very respectful, member of my Zoom call. So let's hope it all goes well. But I mean, let's face it, today's vote, while it's a committee vote, I think it's a coronation. It's expected. It's beyond any doubt that he's going to be approved and he's going to go on to a full Senate vote. And even that outcome shouldn't be in doubt. So it's just a matter of a couple of weeks before he's elevated to the position as CFTC chairman, notwithstanding the fact that several important outside groups have asked Congress to pump the brakes on Quintens's confirmation, and maybe this is a good entry point to talk about that.
It is. I think I do think it's not a matter of if he's going to be confirmed; it's going to be when. I think you're right about that. I do. Who I want to bring in now is Blanche Lincoln. I want to bring in some of those reversals that we've seen over the last decade and a half or so, actually. So Brian Quintens.
We could call this segment "Blanche Takes the Bag."
Oh yeah, I like it.
And use that to frame her dramatic, stunning turnabout. Of course, 15 years is a long time. She may have gained some added perspective over 15 years, but nothing quite resonates as much as an engagement.
Right. Well, let me back up and explain why I'm obsessed with this. So Brian Quintens, of course, marks this expansion in the prediction market industry, this, permissive era of growth for the industry. And, obviously a Republican Congress that wants to see the free market at work, that wants to allow innovation in that space. And an interesting part of that is a very different attitude today in the boom times than 2010 in the wake of the financial crisis, when we're worried about financial guardrails again. And we've talked about I think we touched on the 2010 colloquy between Senators Feinstein and Lincoln back in 2010.
Well, I think it's important to re-raise it here just for the juxtaposition between her two comments. I mean, it's almost like night and day, up and down. You couldn't be more diametrically opposed and more, sort of opposite. You couldn't see two statements that are more in conflict with the two that she made about the very same topic, comparing 2010 to 2025. So what did she say in 2010? And you raised the colloquy between Senator Lincoln and Senator Feinstein.
Right. So it's this
record.
Right. So it's this conversation between the two senators. It's this old congressional record. I believe some of the opposition briefs to Kalshi have touched on it as well.
They more than touched on it. They adopted it and championed her statements 15 years ago in the political
Right.
control contest case that was pending in Washington, D.C. They leaned
Mhm.
heavily
Mhm.
on statements made by Senator Lincoln in the on the floor during the debates. I mean, in essence, she said that Congress did not want sporting events to be traded on derivatives markets, and in particular, she highlighted the Kentucky Derby, the Super Bowl, the Masters golf tournament as examples.
Right. Senator Feinstein raised them as examples and asked, will the CFTC chairman be able to evaluate these as gaming? And, Senator Lincoln said, yes, that is our intent. We want the CFTC commissioner to be able to evaluate those contracts and patrol the line between speculation and gaming there.
I think she went a little bit further and said that these kind of contracts shouldn't be traded on futures markets. And she made the further statement or refinement that sporting events lack the kind of commercial or hedging utility that warrant the listing or that would merit the listing on a CFTC marketplace. So she took the position Congress doesn't want these kinds of events traded on CFTC exchanges. And in any event, these types of sporting events don't, implicate or raise the types of economic, financial, or commercial consequences that would justify its listing and trading on a CFTC marketplace. So she made those two very strident comments when she was in her position as chairwoman of the Senate Agriculture and Nutrition Committee, which oversaw the 2010 Dodd-Frank Act, which amended the Commodity Exchange Act. She was sort of the principal, I wouldn't say the principal drafter, but her committee took the lead role on shepherding this legislation through Congress, and she was chairwoman of that committee. So the statements that she made on the record back in 2010 are not just some random lawmaker speaking off the cuff, but the lawmaker in particular who's in the best position to know what the intent of the legislation was.
Now, fast forward to 2025, she submitted
a long journey from 2010 to 2025, 15 years later. So we got fast forward.
Yeah, and she submitted a comment to the CFTC. The CFTC is still taking public comments about prediction markets from its roundtable that it canceled, but they're still getting letters, and one of them came from the former Senator Lincoln, who is she has her own Lincoln Policy Consulting Group now, the Lincoln Policy Group. Yeah, it apparently that's profitable, and
Shocker.
Yeah, good for her. And she, she submitted a letter supporting Kalshi's sports contracts. So
right,
she went on.
She also said, in contrast to her 2010 statement, that there were no economic or commercial consequences associated with sporting events. She said the exact opposite a couple of weeks ago, and said that sporting events have significant commercial value, advertising revenues. I mean, she went a complete 180 from what she said in the congressional record in 2010. So she went from sporting events shouldn't be traded on derivatives markets to saying states shouldn't be allowed to interfere with the ability to trade these contracts on derivatives markets. And then further, these kinds of contracts have significant economic consequences. So on every account, she, to use a sports metaphor, reversed field, did a complete 180 from the time when she was a lawmaker speaking as chairwoman of a committee to now being a lobbyist, a paid lobbyist. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but she's a paid lobbyist for Kalshi. And, there can't be any mystery about why Kalshi hired that particular lobbyist from Nebraska. They hired her, no doubt, because they wanted to mitigate or ameliorate or offset the harmful comments that she made in 2010 by having her take all of it back in 2025. And while that may play well at the CFTC, I don't think it will make any impact with courts either in this case or in future litigation, because the legislative history is the legislative history. That was 2010. Post-enactment comments made by a lawmaker even one day later are not legislative history. 15 years later, everybody knows what's going on, and they're not entitled to any weight whatsoever. And I don't believe Kalshi utilized her written comments to influence any court cases. They used that in connection with the CFTC prediction markets roundtable to sort of help frame the debate to justify the listing and trading of sports-based event contracts. So the design for her testimony and her comment was to influence what the agency is doing, not so much to have any impact on how courts decide cases, because no court will pay any credence to a 15-year later post-enactment comment made by a paid lobbyist.
Yeah, that'll be interesting to see how it's received. Speaking of the courts, I want to get into Maryland.
That's just so wild. That's why these podcasts and yours and prediction news and what we're doing, I mean, it's not sort of staid material. It's dynamic. It involves not just a cutting edge new market, but also the political aspect of it, which undeniably permeates almost everything we're talking about, through the Trump administration, the new changing of the guard at the CFTC. So it's a very fascinating area because of the political and sort of the the real world aspects of what's happening in sort of parallel with the evolution of the law surrounding these products.
Well, it's made me wonder what the prediction market industry is going to do in either 3 years or 7 years when there's an administration that is that wants to put guardrails back on the industry, or is maybe even hostile to sports contracts and speculative finance more broadly. I mean, these are obviously the boom times for the industry right now, especially with the crypto legislation that could pave a way for regulated crypto platforms, many of which offer prediction markets. In fact, most of the new prediction market companies are crypto. Kalshi is actually the odd man out in that way for the industry. So it'll be interesting to see how the game plan shifts when the industry goes on defense in, like I said, either 3 or 7 years.
That's part of the reason why I think ultimately the real, I would say, important, impactful event that could shape the future of this industry isn't going to be agency rulemaking, because agency rules could always be rescinded, or if the agency does nothing, a new agency head can enforce a different policy and decide to enforce the existing rule. I think the only thing that ultimately sticks here can be legislation. And while Kalshi has enjoyed some early successes in the federal courts, besting Nevada and New Jersey, at least on motions for preliminary injunction, I see the tide ultimately turning here in favor of the states on the issue of whether federal law preempts state gambling laws with respect to these sports-based contracts. I think there's a pretty decent chance that some of the final outcomes will swing in the state's favors. And I see that happening in particular in Maryland and probably the Third Circuit. So if and when that happens, are we back to square one and you put the genie back in the bottle and these prediction markets go away? I don't think that is going to happen. I think even with victory in the courts by the states, sort of the plan B has to be congressional legislation to reinfuse congressional intent into allowing these markets by making a crystal clear statement in the Commodity Exchange Act that swaps include event contracts tied to real world events, including sports contests, and that the CFTC's exclusive jurisdiction over swaps is broad enough to encompass these kinds of sports related event contracts to the exclusion of state gaming regulators' ability to enforce their own state standards against sports contracts traded on CFTC markets. I think ultimately what has to happen, and it might be a race against time, but unless you're changing a statute, all of this seems so ephemeral and temporary And the longer this goes on, if these court battles play out over the next year to 2 years, the Trump administration may find themselves with a changing of the guard in Congress following the midterm elections. So I see the runway, the legitimate runway for changing the statute as being between now and January of 2027. You go any further than that, then the court outcomes will dictate the future of this. But even with adverse court outcomes, it's possible that Kalshi and the lobbyists who are working hand in glove with the administration would try to accelerate statutory amendments to remove any doubt over what Congress intended.
Let me pull you into Maryland, because the state of Maryland filed. They made a filing that pointed the judge's attention to a case in the Fourth Circuit, the Gen Bio case. I wanted to get your thoughts on that. Can you just give us a quick overview of that Fourth Circuit case and how that may play well for Maryland, because it does seem like it could be a high point for state lawmakers, but I've also seen the point of view that if the judge has already made up his mind, then it's superfluous. So tell us about the case and what it might mean.
Well, it's kind of a lazy way of looking at it. I don't mean you, but the Gen Bio Pro decision, which was a lawsuit between, I think, the state of West Virginia and the Food and Drug Administration. West Virginia, as you know, is a very conservative state. It's a red state. So they have a state law that limits access to this abortion drug called mifepristone. I think I'm pronouncing it incorrectly. Mifepristone, which is a medication that's used to end early pregnancies. And that state law is somewhat in conflict with federal standards that maybe allow broader access to the availability of that drug. So the issue in the Gen Bio Pro case, and I think Gen Bio Pro is the manufacturer of this abortion drug, the issue in that case turned on whether the federal standards, the federal law, preempted contrary state statutes with respect to access to this drug.
This drug is FDA approved. Why is it not available in West Virginia?
Yeah. So while it's an abortion case, and it doesn't necessarily mean that the outcome of that case drives the outcome in the Maryland Kalshi case, what was really important about Gen Bio Pro was that the Fourth Circuit, at the perfect time, if you're Maryland, just dropped out of the sky the perfect preemption analysis, which reinforces, and it's probably the leading case in the Fourth Circuit on a concept called the presumption against preemption, which is something that Maryland touched upon very briefly in its briefing, but there hasn't been much decisional law at the Fourth Circuit level on that principle. And what that doctrine essentially says is that in areas or fields that are traditionally regulated by states, such as police powers of the states to protect the public health, safety, and welfare, that when the preemptive effect of federal law touches upon traditional state police powers, there is an even stronger presumption against preemption. And in order to overcome that strong presumption against preemption, the federal law has to be clear and manifest that the intent of Congress is to displace state law on that subject. And I'm going to try to read to you like one or two real quick quotes, but the Fourth Circuit decision says, in areas of traditional state regulation, we assume that a federal statute has not supplanted state law unless Congress has made such an intention clear and manifest. And unless a statute reveals clear and manifest intent to the contrary, we must presume that Congress does not intend to upend the historic relationship of the federal and state governments. And because in this case, states have long regulated abortion under their traditional authority over matters of health and safety, we must assume that this federal statute does not preempt West Virginia's law unless that intention is clear and manifest. Now, we're not talking about the subject of abortion in Kalshi versus Maryland, but we're talking about a different kind of police power. which is the state's historic police power to regulate gambling. And while gambling and abortion are not the same topics, quite obviously, they both fall into the sort of the bucket of being at the heart of the state's police power. And there are several Fourth Circuit decisions, and I'm going to read some of the quotes from a case called Soros versus Manchin, 2011, where the Fourth Circuit wrote that the regulation of gambling enterprises lies at the heart of the state's police power. The formulations of that power underscore the state's paramount interest in the health, welfare, safety, and morals of its citizens. Same thing as abortion. State police powers relating to health, welfare, safety, and morals of its citizens. So we could be talking about abortion or gambling regulation, and for purposes of the court's analysis and the standards that the Fourth Circuit handed down that govern the presumption against preemption, we're talking about the very same standards that apply to both state regulation of abortion and state regulation of gambling. And I think that's a very problematic decision for Kalshi, because I think it gives Judge Abelson a lot more to consider, and he may not have been dwelling on that legal doctrine, but I think it's related to everything that we've talked about in the past when you and I have discussed the role of the Wire Act and PASPA. That's sort of an ancillary to this principle that how could Congress have intended to legalize the trading of sports event contracts under the Commodity Exchange Act, doing so silently. At the same time, Congress was explicit in advancing a federal policy of disfavoring sports gambling through the Wire Act and PASPA. So this is just, a corollary to the same principle, but it provides the court with yet another analytical tool, another statutory tool, where in looking at the issue of congressional intent, and this all boils down to congressional intent, now the standard has to be, the bar that Kalshi has to clear is that Congress was clear and manifest in its intent to allow the trading of sports-related event contracts under CFTC's exclusive jurisdiction. And I don't think that benchmark is necessarily met here, because as we've discussed numerous times on this podcast and on panels, Congress has always been explicit in disfavoring sports gambling through the Wire Act and PASPA, yet the approval through the CEA is somewhat silent, and it seems more like inaction rather than explicit detail. I mean, if you're going to preempt state law, I guess what the Fourth Circuit is saying here is that Congress needs to say that explicitly.
Right, that makes sense. But the court still has to find that these contracts are gaming to begin with, right?
I don't think that's a high bar that needs to be cleared based on Kalshi's in-court admissions in the DC case, as well as this case, that the event contracts tied to sporting events fall within the gaming classification. What Kalshi is arguing is that even though they fall within gaming, the special rule under the Commodity Exchange Act gives the CFTC the right to do a sort of a case-by-case public interest analysis and make its own independent determination in 2025 that at a time when sports betting is legal in 39 states plus the District of Columbia, that it's not contrary to the public interest to allow the trading of these sports-based event contracts when sports-related gaming is legal pretty much in 80% of the states.
Right.
And by the way, Kalshi's counter to my insistence that Congress silently approved this activity, Kalshi's response to the Gen Bio Pro decision. And by the way, they filed a 2-page response to what was a simple bare bones notice of authority. They filed what was the equivalent of a 2-page brief arguing as to why Gen Bio Pro had no relevance or at least application to the outcome here. So I think they're worried about Gen Bio Pro because they went beyond what I think is allowed in federal court pleading by raising substantive arguments in what should have been a very mild response to the notice of supplemental authority. But Kalshi's argument is that we're not preempting state gambling laws. We're not touching the state's ability to regulate sports betting within their own states. We're just saying you can't interfere with sports event contracts that are traded on designated contract markets that are overseen exclusively by the CFTC. So everything outside of that, we're not touching. Congress isn't interfering with. The CFTC doesn't even care about. What we're saying is that there's no preemption of state gambling laws, that just those laws don't apply in a separate regulatory framework that's overseen exclusively by the CFTC. So that's sort of the competing arguments here.
Okay. I want to abruptly switch gears because I was just sent news that just broke now on Bloomberg that Polymarket is buying QCX, a CFTC regulated exchange, and the purchase will allow the crypto betting platform to legally re-enter the US market. And this comes on the heels of the Justice Department dropping 2 investigations into Polymarket that are a couple of years old. So Polymarket is coming back to the US after leaving in January 2022.
Yeah, I mean, they were sanctioned by the CFTC. When we talk about the Justice Department or the CFTC or any federal agency, I think we have to label them by who the president was, because it just seems as if when we transition from one presidential administration to the other, that the work of the former is undone by the latter. And I think during the Biden administration, the CFTC or the SEC, I don't remember which agency, but Polymarket was accused of, I guess, trading contracts without having formally registered with the agency, and then entered into a settlement agreement where they were precluded. I think they had to pay a monetary fine and were enjoined from accepting customers from the United States. And then there's been some suggestion that they've somehow circumvented that. So despite the alleged failure to register and doing a sort of circumvention of a legal agreement with a governmental agency to not accept those kind of contracts from U.S. residents, that despite being accused of those 2 very serious offenses, that the changeover from Biden to Trump ended up sanitizing all that and washing away all the prior ills. So it just seems as if the agencies embark on a completely different course when presidential administrations change, and it's somewhat troubling, the lack of continuity and consistency from administration to administration. We saw that with the Wire Act. You saw the Wire Act reinterpreted by the Obama administration to be limited to sporting events, and then Trump becomes elected in 2016, and his DOJ says no, it encompasses all of gambling, not just sports betting. So it's kind of commonplace. How the law is interpreted by an agency is often dependent upon which president appointed the members of that agency, because we're seeing a complete volatility in how agencies are enforcing their own guidelines against the same companies.
And that was happening to Predicted too, the smaller academic prediction market that focuses on political contracts. It had a no action letter from the CFTC in 2014, but throughout the 2010s, it had to kind of chip away at the contracts that it could offer. So at one point, it had a market on the number of Ebola cases during the big Obama, or it was late in the Obama era. There was that big Ebola outbreak late in the second term, and there was a contract on the number of Ebola cases, and that number depended in part on the federal government's response to the U.S. giving aid and international coordination and these big political decisions. And the CFTC at that time said, no, that's outside the scope of your no action letter. Cut the market, and they've chipped away at those similar markets ever since. Leading up to the CFTC revoking their no action letter in, I believe, 2022. Now, Predicted's been fighting the federal government. They've been fighting the CFTC to remain active in the United States, and they've reached their settlement with the CFTC, and that includes some big upgrades. there are no longer trader limits in their markets. So they finally have as many traders as they want in each of their markets. It was originally a 5,000 trader cap. And they have new position limits. So instead of betting at least up to $850, you can bet up to $5,000. So no, I'm sorry, $3,500. I'm crossing Mars a little bit there, but PredictIt's getting these big upgrades too, and they're benefiting, even though they're not part of the crypto legislation, even though they're not directly benefiting from the crypto lobby. Prediction markets are a huge business for the crypto industry. And so in general, what I think we've seen in these first few months of Trump 2 is what is good for the crypto industry tends to trickle down at least a little bit to the prediction market industry as well. And that is independent of some of the favorable forces in Kalshi's favor.
Yeah. But credit those companies for having the foresight to sort of jump into the CFTC landscape, because the barriers to enter this marketplace now, at least if you want to become a designated contract market, you got to wait a year to 2 years to have this detailed application process and vetting process take place with what is now an understaffed agency. So it seems like the only quick way in is through the DraftKings route of potentially acquiring an existing DCM. And I think they're in negotiations, from what I've read, to acquire what's the name of the DCM, Redbird or
let me grab it.
Railbird.
Yeah, it's Railbird.
So you have Polymarkets and you have PredictIt that have been part of this landscape in one way or another going back several years, and they have significant advantages to being early arrivals, along with Kalshi, at a time when the gaming industry is casting a very sort of casting a glance at an admiring glance at what Kalshi is doing, and wondering how you can, if you can't beat them, can you join them? Yet it's not quite so easy to join them unless you have 20, 30, 40, or 50 million lying around to purchase existing DCM, because otherwise going through that detailed application process statutorily takes a minimum of 6 months, but in reality it's more of a 1 to 2 year wait, and it could even be longer now as more companies seek to become DCMs. There could be a backlog of applications at the CFTC, which is now going to be headed by two commissioners, and with a staffing that's probably 10 to 20% less than the levels that existed a year ago or 2 years ago, at a time when the agency is taking on increasing responsibilities with crypto prediction markets, 24/7 trading, and it's going to be very challenging for any newcomers to pull a Kalshi and expect there to be any type of expediency in the consideration of their application.
Right. Well, Polymarket paid $112 million for QCX, so they want to come back into the United States quite badly. But is there anything else you want to cover before we sign out?
No, I mean, that's the problem when we go 3 weeks or 2 weeks between episodes. Right. Too much stuff gets jammed into the interim, and this is a news cycle that is almost daily. So I think it's a good place to put a wrap in it, and hopefully later this week we can come back with an emergency episode when Judge Abelson hands down his long anticipated ruling on Kalshi's motion for preliminary injunction in Maryland. And that's going to happen, I think, definitely before the end of July, and possibly as soon as this week.
I hope so. I'm getting tired of writing the word "if" in all of my stories about this topic. So, I'll
pass along the message to Judge Abelson and ask him if he could do Prediction News a solid here, because I think it's long overdue. The oral argument took place May 28th, followed by supplemental briefings. So we're almost a month and a half, more than a month and a half post oral argument. So it's time.
Right. Well, if y'all liked what you heard today, follow our reporting at predictionnews.com. Like this video and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And we will see you, I'm sure, soon with more legal and industry updates in this fast growing and boomtown industry. So, Dan, as always, thanks for helping us out, understand it all.
Thanks for having me. Always look forward to our episodes, and thanks everybody for sticking around through this smorgasbord of exciting topics today. So we'll be back soon, hopefully with a Maryland decision.
All right. We'll see y'all.